The dust of the barren street chokes the air, each gust carrying the scent of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and despair. A makeshift platform, rough-hewn planks on barrels, stands before the saloon, its porch overflowing with leering, hardened men. On it, a girl, no more than 16, trembles. Her dress is torn, her face smudged with dirt and tears, her eyes wide with a terror that seems too large for her small frame. An auctioneer, a greasy man with a booming voice, is extolling her dubious virtues. Strong back, this one, barely used. Who'll start the bidding for this prime piece of property? His words are a hammer blow in the oppressive quiet, broken only by a few coarse chuckles. She is an orphan, her last known kin having perished on the trail west, and somehow, through misfortune or malice, she has fallen into the hands of these men. Outlaws by the look of their scarred faces and ready guns, who now see her as chattel. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. A brute with a red bandana and a missing tooth shoves his way forward, coins clinking in his grimy hand. I'll give you $20 for her. She'll learn to be useful or learn to regret it. He snarls, his eyes devouring the girl, Ilara. The auctioneer grins, about to call it. From the shadows of the livery stable across the way, a figure detaches. Tall, clad in dark, trail-worn clothes, a wide-brimmed hat obscuring his features. He moves with a quiet grace that belies the Colt strapped low on his hip. He doesn't speak, not a word. He never does. The guttural laugh of the red bandana outlaw begins to seal her fate, his hand reaching for her. Then, a shadow detaches from the livery wall, swift and silent, his only voice the chilling click of a Colt being cocked. His name was Silas, though few knew it, and none in this god-forsaken end-of-the-road settlement called Perdition's Tooth. He was a man carved from the granite of the high peaks, his silence as profound and unyielding as the wilderness he preferred. Years ago, a fever had stolen his voice, leaving him to navigate the world through keen observation and the eloquent language of action. He drifted for a time, finding work where a strong back and a quiet demeanor were valued more than conversation, eventually settling in a remote cabin nestled deep in the unforgiving canyons, miles from any so-called civilization. He'd come into Perdition's Tooth for supplies, a rare and necessary evil, his senses already on edge from the moment he'd ridden into its single, squalid street. The sight of the girl on the platform, the raw fear in her eyes, the casual cruelty of her captors, it had coiled something tight and cold in his gut, a feeling he hadn't known he still possessed. Ilara's journey to that wretched platform had been a cascade of losses. Orphaned by cholera on the Oregon Trail, she'd been taken in by a distant aunt and uncle whose kindness was as thin as their worn-out wagon canvas. When their own luck ran dry near a mining camp, they'd seen Ilara not as kin, but as a burden too heavy to carry, or perhaps a commodity too tempting to ignore. The details of how she passed from their reluctant care into the clutches of Jedediah Grimes's outlaw gang were a blur of fear and confusion, culminating in this public degradation. Grimes, the man with the red bandana, was known for his brutality. His acquisition of Ilara was less about need and more about a cruel assertion of power, a trophy for his collection of misdeeds. As he'd grabbed her arm, his touch was like a brand, searing a fresh layer of terror onto her already frayed nerves. The world had shrunk to his leering face, his foul breath, the jeers of the crowd. The click of the hammer being drawn back cut through the noise like a scythe. Every head turned. Silas stood in the dusty space between the livery and the saloon, his Colt level, aimed not at Grimes, but at the coins in his outstretched hand. The air crackled. Grimes, startled, looked from his hand to the silent figure. "What in the hell you think you're doing, mister?" he growled, his other hand instinctively moving towards his own sidearm. Silas didn't flinch. His eyes, cold and grey as a winter sky, were fixed on Grimes. He made a minute gesture with his gun barrel, flicking it towards Grimes's coins, then towards the girl, then back to Grimes. The meaning was unmistakable. Drop the claim. Grimes scoffed. "You want her? You got the coin, silent man." He was a bully, used to intimidation, but something in Silas's unwavering stance gave him pause. This wasn't a drunk's bravado or a fool's errand. This was different. Silas slowly shook his head, a single, deliberate motion. No coin. His gaze hardened. He then raised his left hand, fingers splayed, and with his thumb he tapped his chest, then pointed decisively at Ilara. His, not by purchase, but by declaration. "Now see here," the auctioneer blustered. "This ain't how it works." The colt barked once. The $20 piece Grimes was holding spun into the air, a silver glint against the pale sky, before landing with a soft thud in the dust. Grimes yelped, clutching his stinging palm, now empty. Before anyone else could react, before the shockwave of the gunshot had fully subsided, Silas moved. He was a blur of motion, not towards Grimes, but towards the platform. 2 long strides and he was there, his left hand, strong and surprisingly gentle, closing around Ilara's thin arm. He pulled her down from the platform, positioning himself between her and the stunned, now furious, outlaws. "You'll pay for that, you damn," Grimes began, his face contorted with rage, finally drawing his weapon. It was the last mistake he ever made. Silas's Colt spoke again, twice, the shots so close together they sounded like one. Grimes crumpled, a look of astonishment on his face, his unfired gun thudding beside him. 2 of Grimes's companions, recovering their wits, went for their own iron. The silent cowboy moved like a wraith, his shots precise, economical. Lead was his currency, and he paid Ilara's ransom in full measure. Each bark of his pistol was a punctuation mark, ending a worthless life. In moments that stretched into an eternity but lasted mere seconds, it was over. 3 outlaws lay still in the dust. The others, those who hadn't drawn or had been slower, stared, frozen between fear and disbelief. Silas gave them no time to reconsider. He tugged Ilara's arm, a clear, urgent command. "Come." She stumbled after him, her mind a whirlwind of gun smoke, blood, and the terrifying, silent efficiency of her rescuer. He didn't look back. He moved towards his horse, a sturdy buckskin tethered near the livery. With a strength that belied his lean frame, he lifted Ilara and settled her onto the saddle, then swung up behind her, his arm a solid band around her waist, holding her secure. He wheeled the horse and galloped out of Perdition's Tooth, leaving behind a tableau of sudden death and stunned silence, the only sound the fading hoofbeats and the rising wail of the wind through the wretched street. The ride was a blur. Ilara clung to the saddle horn, the hard planes of Silas's chest against her back, the only solid thing in a world that had just been violently remade. Fear was a constant companion, but it had shifted its focus. The immediate terror of Grimes and his men was replaced by a bewildered apprehension of this silent, lethal man who had snatched her from one hell only to drag her into an unknown future. Where was he taking her? Why had he done it? These questions hammered at her, but she had no voice to ask, and he, it seemed, had no voice to answer. They rode for hours, deep into a landscape that grew wilder and more desolate with every mile. The sun beat down, and the jolting rhythm of the horse was punishing. Silas stopped only once, by a small hidden spring, its water shockingly cold and clear. He dismounted, then gently helped Ilara down. Her legs were shaky, her body bruised and aching. He unstrapped a canteen from his saddle, drank, then offered it to her. She hesitated, her eyes wide and questioning. He merely held it out, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Thirst warred with fear, and thirst won. She drank deeply, the water a balm to her parched throat. He then produced a piece of jerky from his saddlebag, broke it in 2, and offered her a piece. Again, the silent offering. She took it, her fingers brushing his calloused hand, and chewed slowly, the tough, salty meat, a strange comfort. He said nothing, did nothing more, simply watched the surrounding terrain, his senses alert, before motioning her back to the horse. As dusk began to purple the canyons, they arrived at a small, isolated cabin tucked into a fold of rock and pine, almost invisible until they were upon it. It was crudely built but solid, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, suggesting a fire recently banked. A small, fenced corral held a couple of pack mules. This, Ilara surmised, was his home. He slid from the saddle, then reached for her. She flinched involuntarily, a reaction born of recent trauma. Silas paused, his hands dropping to his sides. He waited. After a moment, seeing he wasn't going to force her, Elara slowly, painfully, dismounted on her own. He nodded, a slight inclination of his head that might have been approval or simple acknowledgement. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table and 2 stools, a narrow bunk built into one wall, and shelves holding a few necessities. A lantern cast a warm, flickering glow. He gestured towards the bunk, which had a thick, patched quilt on it, an invitation to rest. Elara sank onto it, exhaustion washing over her in a dizzying wave. He moved about the small space with quiet efficiency, adding wood to the fire, fetching a bucket of water from a rain barrel outside. He didn't hover, didn't stare, but she felt his awareness of her, a silent presence that was strangely less threatening than the boisterous cruelty she had escaped. Later, he prepared a simple meal, beans and bacon, cooked in a cast-iron skillet over the fire. The aroma filled the cabin, a homey scent that was achingly foreign to Elara after weeks of fear and deprivation. He served her a portion on a tin plate, then took his own, sitting on one of the stools. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scrape of spoons against tin. Elara found herself watching him. His face, in the firelight, was lean and weathered, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude. His eyes, when they occasionally met hers, were watchful but not unkind. There was a deep sadness in them, she thought, a loneliness that resonated with her own. Days bled into a quiet routine. Silas would rise before dawn, tend to his mules, and then set about whatever tasks the wilderness demanded: hunting, trapping, mending fences, chopping wood. He moved with a purpose, his silence an integral part of his connection to the harsh land. He never tried to force Elara to do anything. He simply left food for her, ensured the water bucket was full. He'd fashioned a second, smaller bunk for her in a corner, stuffing a burlap sack with dried grasses for a mattress and giving her a spare worn blanket. It was a gesture of consideration that touched her more than words could have. Elara, at first, was a bundle of nerves, starting at every sound, her sleep plagued by nightmares. She watched Silas constantly, trying to decipher his intentions from his movements, his expressions. His muteness was a barrier, yet his actions began to speak a language she slowly started to understand: provision, protection, a strange, unspoken respect for her space. He never intruded, never demanded. He simply was. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple-black. Lightning split the heavens, followed by deafening claps of thunder that shook the little cabin. Elara, caught outside near the woodpile, cried out, a small, involuntary sound. She'd always been terrified of storms, and this one was a monster. She scrambled back towards the cabin, rain lashing down, soaking her to the skin. Silas was already at the door, holding it open. As another bolt of lightning illuminated the canyon, followed by a particularly violent crash of thunder, Elara squeezed her eyes shut and pressed herself against the cabin wall, trembling uncontrollably. Silas closed the door, shutting out the worst of the storm's fury. He looked at her, huddled and shaking. For a moment, he just stood there. Then he walked to his bunk, took the patched quilt, and silently offered it to her. She looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. He simply held it out. Slowly she reached for it, her cold fingers brushing his. He then went to the hearth and built up the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows. He didn't try to comfort her with words he didn't have, but his presence, his calm industry in the face of the storm's rage, was a reassurance in itself. Elara wrapped the quilt around her, the wool rough but warm, and edged a little closer to the fire. He sat on his stool, cleaning his rifle, his movements steady and unhurried. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace began to settle. It was the first time she hadn't felt entirely alone in her fear. Slowly, Elara began to emerge from her shell. She started by tidying the cabin, a small way to contribute, to feel useful. She swept the rough plank floor with a broom Silas had fashioned from twigs, washed their few dishes, mended a tear in one of his shirts with a needle and thread she found in a small tin box. Silas would watch her sometimes, a fleeting, unreadable expression in his eyes, but he never commented, never interfered. He simply accepted her small efforts. One day, he returned from hunting with a young deer slung over his shoulder. He set about butchering it with practiced skill. Ilara watched, fascinated and a little repulsed. He paused, looked at her, then picked up a strip of fresh venison and held it out, as if offering her a chance to learn, or perhaps just to share in the process. Hesitantly, she took it. He then showed her, through gestures, how to slice it thin for jerky. She was clumsy at first, but he was patient, correcting her grip on the knife with a gentle adjustment of her hand. It was the closest they'd come to a shared task, a silent lesson, a tiny spark of connection. Their peaceful, isolated existence was fragile, however. The world outside the canyon still existed. One morning, Silas was checking his trap lines further down the valley when he spotted a lone rider, far in the distance, but moving with a deliberation that suggested he wasn't merely lost. Silas watched from concealment, his eyes narrowed. The rider was well armed, his horse sturdy. He looked like a manhunter. Silas's gut tightened. Had news of the events in Perdition's Tooth spread? Were Grimes's associates looking for revenge, or for the property they felt had been stolen? He returned to the cabin with a grin set to his jaw. Ilara, who was learning to read the subtle shifts in his demeanor, knew something was wrong. He didn't try to explain with gestures, not then. Instead, he took out his rifle, meticulously cleaned and oiled it, then checked his ammunition. His actions were a louder warning than any words. Fear, a cold serpent, uncoiled in Ilara's stomach. She thought she had found a sanctuary, but the outside world, with its dangers and its judgments, was encroaching. The rider didn't appear that day, or the next. A tense watchfulness settled over the cabin. Silas spent more time scanning the horizon, his usual quiet deepening into a somber vigilance. Ilara found herself jumpy again, the progress she'd made in trusting him, in feeling safe, threatened by this unseen menace. One evening, as Silas sat by the fire, sharpening his hunting knife, Ilara gathered her courage. She picked up a charred stick from the hearth and, on a relatively clean patch of the wooden floor, she hesitantly began to draw. She drew a crude figure of a man on a horse, then looked at Silas, her eyes questioning. He stopped his sharpening, his gaze fixed on her drawing. He nodded slowly. Then, he took the stick from her, and beside her drawing, he drew 3 more stick figures, then crossed them out with a decisive X, Grimes and his men. Then he drew a simple outline of their cabin, and then a figure of a girl inside it, her. He pointed to the girl, then to himself, then made a broad, encompassing gesture with his hands, as if to shield the drawing of her in the cabin. "I protect you here." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. It was the clearest communication they had ever shared, a silent vow. She understood. The rider he'd seen was a threat to her, to them, and he was preparing to meet it. Her fear was still present, but now it was mingled with a fierce, unexpected surge of loyalty, of wanting to help this silent man who had risked everything for her. She was no longer just a victim. She was part of this, their shared struggle for safety. The anticipated threat didn't materialize immediately as a direct assault. Instead, it came in a more insidious form. They were running low on certain supplies: salt, flour, coffee, things Silas couldn't hunt or forage. A trip to the nearest trading post, a tiny, fly-speck settlement called Redemption Creek, about a day's ride away, became unavoidable. It was a risk, but a necessary one. Ilara, surprisingly, indicated she wanted to go. She did this by pointing to herself, then to the mules, then mimicking the act of riding. Silas considered her, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps he thought it was safer to have her with him than to leave her alone, or perhaps he sensed her need to face the world, however small a part of it, and not remain a frightened recluse. He finally nodded his assent. Redemption Creek was a collection of rough buildings huddled by a muddy stream, marginally more civilized than Perdition's Tooth, but still radiating an aura of hardship and suspicion. As they rode in, leading a pack mule, Ilara felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her. Silas, a tall, silent figure, naturally drew attention, and the presence of a young girl with him, her origins unknown, fueled a current of whispers and sidelong glances. Inside the dusty confines of the general store, the storekeeper, a portly man named Henderson with shifty eyes, appraised them both. "Needin' something?" he asked, his voice oily. Silas handed him a list, painstakingly written in a clear, blocky script. Henderson scanned it, his gaze lingering on Ilara. "That'll be a fair bit," he said then, his eyes flicking to Silas. "Where'd you pick her up, friend? Don't see many young uns this far out." Silas's eyes, normally placid, hardened to chips of ice. He didn't respond, simply met Henderson's gaze until the storekeeper looked away, flustered. As Henderson gathered their supplies, a woman, her face a mask of pinched disapproval, entered the store. She openly stared at Ilara, then at Silas, her lips pursed. "Some folks got no shame," she muttered, loud enough for them to hear, before addressing Henderson about some trivial purchase. Ilara flushed, shame and anger warring within her. She felt Silas shift beside her, a subtle movement, but she knew he'd heard. When Henderson finished tallying their goods, Silas paid in furs, his movements economical. As they were about to leave, the woman spoke again, her voice sharp with accusation. "Ain't right. A man like that with a girl her age. What's her story, Henderson, you know?" Before Henderson could reply, Silas turned. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood, his full height seeming to fill the narrow space, and fixed the woman with a look of such cold, quiet intensity that she physically recoiled, her words dying in her throat. He then placed a hand lightly on Ilara's shoulder, a protective, possessive gesture, and guided her out of the store. Outside, Ilara's composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her face. The woman's words, the judgmental stares, had reopened wounds she thought were beginning to heal. Silas stopped the mules under the shade of a lone cottonwood. He turned to Ilara, his expression surprisingly gentle. He reached out hesitantly, and with a calloused thumb, brushed a tear from her cheek. He couldn't offer words of comfort, but the simple, unexpected tenderness of the gesture spoke volumes. He then rummaged in one of the supply sacks and pulled out a small, brightly colored ribbon he must have added to the order, something entirely frivolous. He held it out to her. Ilara stared at it, then at him, a watery smile breaking through her tears. It was such a small thing, yet it felt monumental. A silent acknowledgement of her girlhood, a defiance of the ugliness they had just faced. She took the ribbon, her fingers closing around it. In that moment, the bond between them, forged in violence and nurtured in silence, deepened into something akin to trust, perhaps even affection. The world could be cruel and judgmental, but in this mute man's protection, she was beginning to find a strength she didn't know she possessed. The ride back to the cabin was different. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with an unspoken understanding. The peace, however, was short-lived. A few days after their return from Redemption Creek, as dusk settled over the canyon, Silas, who had been out checking the perimeter of their small valley, returned with a grim urgency. He didn't need to draw pictures this time. The set of his jaw, the way he immediately checked the cabin's door and window shutters, told Ilara everything. The threat he had sensed before was no longer distant. It was here. He gestured for Ilara to stay away from the single window, then took up his rifle, positioning himself where he could watch the main approach to the cabin without being easily seen. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The only sounds were the crackling of the low fire and Ilara's own ragged breathing. She huddled on her bunk, clutching the colorful ribbon Silas had given her, a small token of hope against the encroaching darkness. Then, a voice cut through the stillness, rough and menacing. "Silas, we know you're in there, and we know you got something that belongs to us." Ilara's blood ran cold. It was one of Grimes's men, one she vaguely remembered from Perdition's tooth, his face cruel and leering. There were more voices, a low murmur of them, surrounding the cabin. Silas didn't move, didn't make a sound. His focus was absolute. "Grimes might be gone," the voice continued, "but his property ain't yours for the taking. Send the girl out, and maybe we'll let you live, mute man." A coarse laugh followed. Ilara pressed herself further into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Silas. His profile was stark against the dim light, his expression unyielding. He slowly shook his head, a minute gesture meant for her, a reassurance and a warning. "Stay put. I handle this." "Last chance, Silas," the outlaw shouted, "or we burn you out." Silas still didn't respond verbally. Instead, he raised his rifle slightly. Elara saw him take a slow, steadying breath. He was a man who spoke with lead, and he was about to make a very definitive statement. The outlaws, emboldened by his silence, must have assumed he was cowed or alone. One of them, impatient, made a rush for the door, intending to kick it in. It was a fatal error. Silas's rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A strangled cry from outside, followed by the thud of a falling body. "Damn you, mute," another voice roared, and then the night erupted in gunfire. Bullets thudded into the cabin walls, splintering wood. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, a small cry escaping her lips. Silas moved with swift, deadly precision, firing, ducking, reloading, a silent whirlwind of defensive fury. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for hers, for the sanctuary he had painstakingly built. During a brief lull in the firing, Elara, peeking through her fingers, saw Silas press himself against the wall beside the window, listening. One of the outlaws was trying to creep along the side of the cabin, perhaps to try the window or set a fire. Silas was focused on the sounds from that direction. Suddenly, from the other side of the cabin, a floorboard near the hearth creaked. An outlaw had managed to pry loose some stones from the chimney's base and was trying to squeeze through. Silas couldn't see him, his attention was elsewhere. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. Without thinking, fueled by a desperate surge of adrenaline and loyalty, she grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth. It was all she could do. As the outlaw's head and shoulders emerged from the makeshift opening, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph in the dim firelight, Elara screamed, a raw, wordless sound of fury and fear, and swung the poker with all her might. The poker connected with the side of the outlaw's head with a sickening thud. He grunted, his eyes rolling back, and slumped half in, half out of the opening, momentarily stunned. The sound, Elara's scream and the impact, made Silas whirl around. He saw the incapacitated outlaw, saw Elara standing over him, poker still raised, trembling but resolute. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. That split-second distraction she'd created, that small, brave act, was enough. The outlaw, trying to flank him by the window, hearing the commotion, made his move. But Silas was ready. He spun back, his rifle barking, and the threat from the window was neutralized. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The outlaws, having lost at least 2, possibly 3 of their number, and realizing Silas was not alone and not easily overcome, seemed to lose their nerve. After a few more sporadic shots which Silas answered with deadly accuracy, there was a sound of hurried retreat, of horses galloping away into the night. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. The cabin was a wreck, bullet holes pocking the walls, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Silas slowly lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. He turned to Elara. She was still standing by the hearth, the poker hanging limply in her hand, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce light he hadn't seen before. He walked over to her, his gaze intense. He looked at the stunned outlaw, then back at Elara. He reached out and gently took the poker from her trembling hand. Then he did something he had never done before. He reached out and placed his hand on her head, a brief, almost clumsy gesture that was nevertheless filled with an overwhelming sense of approval, of gratitude, of something akin to pride. Elara looked up at him, tears now streaming down her face, not from fear, but from relief and the raw emotion of the moment. She had faced her demons, not by running, but by fighting alongside him. She had found her voice, not in words, but in courage. In the aftermath of the attack, a profound quiet settled over the small cabin, a silence no longer born of fear or unfamiliarity, but of shared ordeal and a deeply forged connection. Silas moved first, his actions deliberate as he checked the exterior, ensuring the immediate threat had truly passed. The night air was cold and carried the faint, acrid scent of gunpowder. Elara, her limbs still trembling from adrenaline, watched him from the doorway. When he returned, his gaze met hers, and in the dim light of the lantern, she saw not the hardened gunman, but a man weary to his bones, yet resolute. He gently tended to a shallow graze on his arm, a souvenir from the fight, his movements economical. Elara, without a word, brought him a strip of clean cloth from her small store of mending things and the water bucket. He paused, looking at the offering, then at her face, and nodded, allowing her to clumsily help him clean and bind the wound. It was a small act of care, a reversal of their initial dynamic, and it spoke volumes of the trust that had grown between them. The outlaw Ilara had struck lay groaning, tied up securely in a corner. Silas dealt with him at dawn, marching him several miles from the cabin and sending him on his way with a stark, silent warning never to return, his horse confiscated. He returned to find Ilara attempting to sweep up the debris, her movements slow but determined. She was no longer just the rescued orphan, she was a participant in their survival, her agency asserted in the heat of battle. When Silas entered, she looked up, a question in her eyes. He simply nodded, indicating the outlaw was gone. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it left her momentarily weak. Over the next few days, they worked together to repair the cabin. Silas, with his practical skills, mended the splintered wood and reinforced the door. Ilara, with a surprising practicality of her own, helped clear the mess, her presence a quiet constant by his side. The bullet holes remained, scars on their small fortress, but also reminders of what they had overcome together. The land around them, once just a wilderness Silas inhabited, began to feel like a shared territory, a place they had defended and made their own. There was no formal declaration, no grand pronouncements. There couldn't be, but the nature of their relationship had irrevocably shifted. He was her protector, yes, but she was no longer merely the protected. She was his partner in this isolated life, her resilience, a match for his quiet strength. One evening, as Silas was carving a piece of wood by the fire, a small, rough bird taking shape under his skilled hands, Ilara, who had been practicing her letters on a piece of slate he'd found for her, looked up. She pointed to the bird, then to herself, then made a gesture of flying away, a hesitant question. "Will I have to leave one day?" Silas stopped carving. He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, he put down the bird and the knife. He reached out very slowly and gently took her hand, the one not holding the slate. He held it for a moment, his calloused palm rough against hers. Then, he brought her hand to his chest, placing it over his heart. He tapped it lightly, then pointed around the small cabin, encompassing both of them, their shared space. He shook his head, a firm, definitive no. "This is your place, with me." A slow smile spread across Ilara's face, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her eyes. She squeezed his hand, a silent acceptance, a silent thank you. In that moment, the auction block, the leering outlaws, the fear and uncertainty, all receded into a distant, painful memory, overshadowed by the quiet certainty of this man's unwavering protection and the unexpected sanctuary she had found in his silent world. The seasons turned. The harshness of the land remained, but within the small circle of their cabin, a fragile sense of normalcy, even peace, took root. Ilara learned the rhythms of Silas's life, anticipating his needs, helping with chores, her initial fear replaced by a quiet competence. She learned to read his expressions, the subtle shifts in his eyes, the set of his jaw, a language more eloquent than any spoken word. He in turn watched her grow, no longer a terrified child, but a young woman discovering her own strength and worth. He taught her to track, to identify edible plants, to shoot a small rifle he had, with a patience that surprised even himself. One late afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the canyon, Silas returned from checking his trap lines, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. Ilara was outside, tending to a tiny patch of hardy vegetables she had managed to coax from the stubborn soil, humming a tuneless song, a sound of contentment that had become increasingly common. He paused, watching her, a rare softness in his eyes. She looked up, saw him, and her humming turned into a small, welcoming smile. He'd paid a ransom in lead, a brutal price for a life. But in doing so, he had found something far more valuable, a connection, a purpose, a quiet joy that filled the vast silence of his world. He walked towards her, the setting sun glinting off the barrel of his rifle, and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this wild, isolated canyon, with this resilient girl by his side, was finally, truly home. The cabin, once just a shelter, now bore the marks of their shared existence. A neatly stacked woodpile, the faint scent of Ilara's baking from the small oven Silas had ingeniously improved, the worn path between the door and the spring. He watched her as she mended one of his shirts by the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration, the colorful ribbon he'd bought her tied in her hair. He knew then that the transaction in Perdition's Tooth, however violent and unorthodox, had yielded more than just a rescued life. It had brought him his own. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.